What if our laws are contrary to God's law?
Once again, we have to take the attitude that Peter did in Acts 5 and verse 29. We ought to obey God rather than man. You see, the submission that God demands in Romans chapter 13 is to lawful authority. God never demands that we submit to unlawful, usurped, tyrannical authority. The state has no business leaving the lawful area and sphere of authority that God has given to it. When it does, it has no binding influence. It has no binding power at all. The interesting thing is, the Constitution of the United States even says this as well. Did you know that the Constitution said that this Constitution and the laws made in pursuance thereof, that is, in agreement with the Constitution, and all treaties which are made in agreement with the Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. And it says that all the judiciary shall be so bound. The Constitution or the laws of any state notwithstanding. In other words, no state, no group of people, no one has any right to pass a law, a statute, or an ordinance that conflicts with the Constitution of the United States. If they do, then that law is null and void, ab initio, from the beginning. It has no binding power, and the Constitution said the judiciary shall so declare it. So neither in the Word of God nor in the Constitution are the people bound to obey usurped tyrannical authority. Now, it is true that there is a lawful governmental authority. And we as Christians are not anarchists. We want to be submissive to a lawful, godly government. We're ready to. But God never requires us to submit to tyranny and to submit to a dictatorship. He never requires us to do that which is contrary to the Word of God or contrary to His law. God has given us government to be a blessing to us. In fact, the purpose of government is spelled out very plainly in Romans 13 verses 3 and 4 and 1 Peter 2 and verse 14. Government is for the punishment of evildoers and for the protection of the good doers. And so very obviously, God is not going to take that which He has ordained for our good and turn it around and let it be for our bad and an instrument of bondage and enslavement. So there is no submission owed to tyranny. Let me show you. I could not look at my wife and say, "Sweetheart, we're short on money this month. I want you to take this pistol and go rob the bank so I can have enough money to pay my bills." Why could I not do that? You say, but Brother Weaver, the Bible says, "Wives, obey your husbands in everything." And the Bible does say that in Ephesians chapter 5. I could look at my wife and say, "God says you've got to obey me in everything. Now take this pistol and go rob the bank." You know what she should say? She should say, "Honey, I love you, and I want to be submissive to you, but God has never given you authority to violate His law. God has never given you authority to command me to go contrary to the Word of God. I want to obey you, but in this instance, I have to obey God rather than man. I cannot rob that bank." Now, very obviously, my authority as a husband is limited. I do not have the authority to command her to go contrary to the Word of God. Likewise, the authority of the government is limited. It does not have the authority to ask us to do anything that's contrary to the Word of God or even contrary to the Constitution of the United States. When it leaves its sphere of lawful authority, it loses its authority.
What will happen to America if we continue on the same course?
To answer that, you've got to understand the covenantal nature of government. You see, in the Bible, government is covenantal in nature. In fact, 2 Kings chapter 11 and many other passages, tells you that basically there are two types of covenants when in relationship to government. First of all, there was the covenant between God, the king, and the people. Now, in that covenant, the king or the civil ruler agreed to be God's ruler, and the people agreed to be God's people. And then the second covenant was between the king and the people. That is, he agreed to rule faithfully and lawfully, and they agreed to be obedient. Now, numerous times in the Bible speaks about this covenantal relationship in civil government. Now, there are certain verses in the Bible you cannot even understand unless you comprehend this covenantal nature of government. For instance, in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse 3, Solomon said that he exhorted us to keep the king's commandment, and that in relationship to the oath of God. What oath? Well, it was the oath taken at the covenant. In other words, we agree to obey as long as the governor rules faithfully and lawfully. Now, the Bible tells us in Romans chapter 13 that we are to be in submission to godly civil rulers, not only for wrath's sake, that is, because they have the power of the sword, but also, secondly, for conscience sake. Now, the word conscience in the Greek is suneidesis. Sun is a preposition which means with, eidesis, to know. When you come to the English word conscience, con is a preposition which means with, and science means to know. Your conscience is that which you know with. So God says we're to be in submission to a lawful, godly civil government because we know that we ought to be, because it's the ordinance of God. Now, in understanding the covenantal nature of government, you've got to remember this. First of all, in biblical covenants, when one party violates the covenant, then it looses the other party from obedience. Now, that's not only true in biblical covenants, that's true in our human covenant as well. For instance, I could take you in the Bible and show you that, as well as practical experience today. In Joshua chapter 2, the two spies entered into a covenant with Rahab. There were the parties of the covenant. Then there were the stipulations given to the covenant. They said, now look, here are the stipulations. If you want to be spared when we come back in and fight, you've got to hang this scarlet cord out of the window that you let us down by. Moreover, you have to have all of your family in your house because we don't know who belongs to you. Now, if any of your family comes out in the street and we kill them, well, that's too bad because they ought to be in the house. We don't know who is your family. But on the other hand, they said, if we come in this house and hurt anyone, then their blood is going to be on us. That is, we will have violated our end of the covenant. And so as they started to leave, they said, oh, there's one more stipulation. She said, what is it? They said, if you utter any of this, our business, then we're quit of our oath. In other words, if you violate your end of the covenant, if you don't keep this secret, then we're not obligated to keep our end of the covenant. And she said, according to your word, so be it. Now, we have in our land today courts of equity. If you tell me that you're going to build me a garage for $10,000, and that garage is going to be a 20 by 40, and that you agree to build it out of cypress wood, and that you agree to shingle it with cedar shakes, all for $10,000, and then you agree to wait until the job is complete for me to pay you, and then when you get the job halfway finished, you come in and say, I want my money, and I said, I'm not going to give it to you. And you say, why? I said, well, you're violating the covenant. You're violating the contract. You say, well, I'll take you to the courts. I said, well, take me. And so the judge looks at me and says, Mr. Weaver, did you not agree to give this man $10,000 for a garage? I said, yes. Well, he said, why don't you do it? And I said, because, Your Honor, here's the contract. He agreed to build me a 20 by 40. He's built me a 15 by 30. He agreed to use cedar wood. He's used pine. He agreed to put cedar shakes on the house. And he's just put simple tile up there. And moreover, he said that he would wait until the job was finished before I had to give him the money. Here it is in black and white. And the judge looks at me and then looks at you and says, case dismissed. You don't owe him a thing. He's violated his end of the covenant, And you don't have to give your end of the covenant obedience until He performs His end.